I'm Howard Silver. I'm the Executive Director of the Consortium of Social Science Associations, or COSA. We are the advocacy group for the social and behavioral sciences. We have about 115 members, professional associations, scientific societies, universities, research centers, and institutes, and we think of ourselves as a bridge between the academic research community and the Washington policy-making community. And we think of these sessions as doing that job of being a bridge. I am also a former chairman of the Coalition for National Science Funding, which is one of the co-sponsors of the event. CNSF promotes funding for the National Science Foundation, consists of 120 groups across all of the sciences and engineering, as well as universities and industrial groups. I would like to call your attention, in your packets, there is an invitation to CNSF's annual exhibition of NSF-supported research, which will take place on May 7th in this room and the two rooms to our left. I would like to thank our briefing sponsors, Frank Wolf and Rush Holt, who are co-chairs of the Congressional Research and Development Caucus, for their support and leadership in hosting this event and getting us the room. They and the R&D Caucus have been persistent champions for the engineering and science community, and we owe them our thanks and gratitude. The Congressional R&D Caucus was founded to highlight the national importance of research and the interdependence of research efforts across disciplines, and to increase awareness of members of Congress and their staffs on issues related to R&D. I would also like to thank a whole bunch of people who helped put this event together. My staff at COSA, Angela Sharp and Julia Milton, as well as Catherine Holmes and Rashida Smith of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Chris Rackens of Representative Holt's staff, Chris Brantley of the IEEE, and Susan Mason of NSF for all their help in getting this event together. So it's now my pleasure to introduce my friend for over 20 years, the acting director of the National Science Foundation, Cora Merritt. Since January of 2009, she has served as NSF's acting director, acting deputy director, senior advisor, and regular deputy director, and now is acting director. She has also been the assistant director for 2 of NSF's directorates, the only person in history to do that, both the Education and Human Resources Directorate, and as the first AD for the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate. If you're interested in the rest of her accomplishments, which are many, there are bios for all of the speakers in your packets. So, Cora?
Thanks very much. I want to thank Howard, but thank the sponsoring organizations too. So the Consortium for Social Sciences, or the Consortium for Social Science Associations, the Coalition for National Science Funding, and also echoing what Howard just mentioned, expressing the gratitude of the Foundation for the congressional support for this event. And he's already mentioned how significant it is that Congressmen Holt and Wolf are the hosts for this event on behalf of the R&D Caucus. Now, as all of you undoubtedly know, the National Science Foundation is the only federal agency that funds basic research in science and engineering across all fields. I say that even though people will often say, what about biomedical? If you look at our portfolio, you will even find in that portfolio support for fundamental ideas that have relevance for biomedical science. Now, for the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, the research we support centers on fundamental knowledge about human behavior, about social interactions, about economic and other systems that people create, along with the institutions, political, cultural, religious, among others, the kinds of institutions that humans create. Now, the fundamental knowledge can bear on a range of problems and policies. So within, again, the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, NSF seeks to unveil primary principles, models, and premises on which human endeavors rest. This quest, of course, for underlying axioms is common to what NSF promotes in all fields in which NSF invests. So this is not unique. This search for the primary principles, models, and premises, that is what unifies what we undertake at the National Science Foundation. The recently released document, Bringing People into Focus, provides details on the foundational frameworks that NSF emphasizes and the links between those frameworks and contemporary problems and policies. Today's briefing places fundamental frameworks within the context of disasters, a topic of far-reaching importance. The cost associated with natural and human-induced disasters in the United States, the costs have risen to hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And over the past 30 years, such disasters have resulted in tens of thousands of lives lost and many times that number of people injured or affected. And in fact, it's often because of the effect on human lives and human well-being. Thank you very much, Congressman Holt, for joining us. It's often because of the effects on human lives and well-being that events come to be depicted as disasters. That's why they're disasters, because we see those kinds of consequences. Now, we're pleased to have today a distinguished group of NSF-funded researchers to probe with us the dynamics of disaster preparedness, of human resilience, and the social and political consequences of cataclysmic events. Now, importantly, questions about these dynamics have such significance that the Directorate for the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, represented here by its Assistant Director, Dr. Gutman. But these questions are so important that this directorate is not the only unit within the National Science Foundation that funds the explorations around disasters. The Directorate for Engineering, and Dr. Dennis Winger is here. The Directorate for Engineering has long drawn on social scientists to lead an initiative on disasters and to undertake research on the topic. And in fact, people here who are assembled have often received their support from engineering. I want to thank all of you for being here, even if the numbers are a bit higher than had been anticipated. But you came to hear the presenters. So without further ado, I'm turning the podium back to Dr. Silver.
Congressman, we are delighted to have one of our co-sponsors, Congressman Rush Holt, with us. First elected in 1998, Dr. Holt represents the 12th District of New Jersey, which includes both Princeton and Rutgers universities. He's a PhD physicist, and for almost a decade, he was assistant director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, the largest research facility of Princeton University and the largest center for alternative research on alternative energy in New Jersey. He has conducted extensive research on alternative energy and has his own patent for a solar energy device. Representative Holt serves on the Committee on Education and the Workforce, the Committee on Natural Resources, and was a founding member of today's sponsor, the Congressional R&D Caucus. He's been a tremendous force for educating Congress and the public about the importance of science and engineering research to our daily lives. He has also been a stalwart supporter of the Department of Education's Title VI International Education and Foreign Language Programs. And for that, we thank him too. Congressman Holt.
Thanks. Well, it's great to see so many people here. It's confirmation that the R&D caucus has the best seminars, the best meetings. And I thank you all for coming, and I thank the presenters and NSF for setting this up. Although I'm a physicist by background and training, I've spent a lot of time here on the Hill defending social sciences research, sometimes from attacks. And so I'm really pleased that this is taking place. It is appropriate. It's an appropriate area of research for the NSF. It is an appropriate area of research for the government to fund. It is an important cluster of areas for us to be involved in. So I'm delighted that this is taking place. I'm pleased to see so many of you here. Since we have now, I think, some people that I haven't seen here before, I will invite you to come to all of our R&D caucus gatherings. Representative Wolf and I, as co-chairs, and Judy Biggert before, a former representative, want to give a place, a locus, a caucus to the Congress where we can deal with questions of research and development writ large. There are people here, subgroups that are interested in transportation research or biological health sciences research or even more limited than that. But there is no place other than this, I would argue, where we have an opportunity to talk about research and development and to think about policy affecting research and development in the public sector and the private sector writ large. And whether we as a nation and as a government are investing sufficiently in research, I would argue not, but this is where we can deal with that. And it is really important that we face these questions. I thank you all for coming. I thank you. I thank Representative Wolf for setting this up, and the NSF for setting this up and presenting it to you. Thanks for coming. Thanks.
All right. Great. Okay. We appreciate that very much. Thank you. I will now briefly introduce our speakers. As I said earlier, there are full biographies in the packets, and I will introduce them all so we can facilitate this. Dan O'Hare is the interim Senior Vice Provost for Student Success, as well as the Dean of the College of Communication and Information and Professor of Communication at the University of Kentucky. He's been president of the National Communication Association, and this is not his first appearance at a COSA briefing. Roxanne Cohn-Silver, who I claim is my long-lost sister, but she says we're not related, is professor in the Department of Psychology and Human Behavior, the Department of Medicine, and the Program of Public Health at the University of California, Irvine. She's done yeoman work on resilience to disasters, which she will describe to you, and has won numerous awards from many of the psychological associations. Elizabeth Frankenberg is professor of public policy and sociology at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. She's a demographer whose research focuses on the ways in which health and social service environments shape the well-being of individuals, the ways that interactions among family members influence well-being, and how individuals respond to changes induced by unexpected events. And she will be our consequences person. And so with that, let me turn the podium over to the speakers, Dan, and hopefully the technology will work.
Let me add my welcome and thanks to those individuals who were sponsors of this. Congressman Holt very much appreciate you being here with us. Howard, thanks so much for being the brainchild behind this, and certainly, Director Merritt, pleased to have you as well. It's a distinct pleasure for me to be with these panelists as well. I've read their work on multiple occasions, and you're in for quite a treat whenever they speak about what they have been doing with the support of NSF. Dennis Winger, they were talking about how engineering collaborates with SBE. That is exactly the reason why we were able to do the work that you're about to see from us. It was a highly collaborative effort looking at hurricane warning systems. Key constructs that guided our work through this project and subsequent work were based on the following questions. How do extreme events, media, and message strategies interact to affect human decision making? The previous contexts that led up to this, that ran up to this, were cancer, context of terrorism, context of severe weather, and most recently, hospital discharge misadventures. Now, depending upon the context, do media influence messages or vice versa? And that was one of the key drivers behind our research. The reason we ask that, because we want to determine, are there cross-contextual similarities in extreme events? In other words, are there lessons to be learned from one type of extreme event to another, from terrorism to natural disasters? So we developed a proposal at the University of Oklahoma at the time with the National Center for Atmospheric Research to develop a hurricane warning model. I want to acknowledge all of my collaborators, especially Rebecca Morris, who served as the prime PI, and others that you see here on the screen. The traditional weather warning dissemination model is one where there's a source of information. Let's call it this time the National Hurricane Center, the NHC. They will develop their data, and then they will submit it to the National Weather Service. They will submit it to emergency managers, who then disseminate it to newspapers and televisions and radio stations and so forth, who are the intermediate receivers. The eventual receivers are people like you and I that seek out the intermediate receivers for that information to try to decide what we're going to do or what kind of decision we're going to make. The current hurricane system is a little more complicated. And one of the reasons why, you know as well as I do, is that the intermediate receivers, that is television stations and emergency managers and the National Hurricane Center, interact with each other on a more frequent basis through multiple channels now. But that's not what makes this even more interesting. It's that the final receivers are also interacting with each other. They are actually putting information out that the intermediate receivers have to take into consideration to either confirm or disconfirm as true information or ground truth information about hurricane warnings and associated information. So there's been a breakdown in this linear process of disseminating information to people. It requires then collaboration. So the first stage of the research that we sought to do was to determine the level of collaboration that was happening among all of these players in the hurricane warning system. What is the nature of communication, and what are the effects of these messages and so forth on the actors in the forecasting and warning system? So in terms of creating the message, we used boundary spanning theories, we used organizational conflict theories, and in the second piece of the project that I'm going to talk about this afternoon in terms of how do individuals interpret the message, we looked at self-reports through a quasi-experimental design using both self-reports and physiological arousal. So we're looking at it from a fairly nonlinear perspective. As I mentioned to you before, there's multiple actors in this process, including the National Weather Service, local emergency managers, and the all-important broadcast meteorologists, which I'll refer to as broadcast METs from here on out. And we also included a Spanish language station as part of our data corpus. We did interviews. We looked at the major themes of accuracy versus timeliness. Think about it. if you have different players in this process, who do you think's most interested in the timeliness of communication? Who has the most at stake? Broadcast meteorologists, right? They want to break news at 6:11 in the evening, or at 7:11 in the evening if you're on the Eastern time. They are on a time clock, so they are very interested in the timeliness of information. What about the National Hurricane Center? Accuracy. This is what they're supposed to be. This is where their credibility is that they were accurate. So you can already see a tension between many of the players that are part of this warning system. You have some that are disseminating information, broadcast Mets, that have a very intense desire in making sure the timing is there. Then you have the scientists that want to make sure it's right. So instead of it being a two-way street between the National Hurricane Center and the broadcast meteorologist, it's a one-way street. The broadcast Mets are totally about customers and consumers. This is what they were telling us. This is what our research results reveal. They seek, and then broadcast meteorologists, when they don't get the information they want in a timely fashion, will seek information from other sources. They may seek their own. They may seek information from their National Weather Center, a local office. Forecasters are also at the mercy of the National Hurricane Center forecasters. One of them mentioned to us, quote, "We don't receive their full suite of products until about 5 or 10 minutes before 4 o'clock, and everyone has a newscast at 5. So the central issue is about cycle times. So there's bottom lines and there's deadlines. Now, another key player, especially in the Houston area, are the emergency managers. What they told us is that media are first and foremost businesses, thank you so much, businesses with deadlines. And the emergency managers are primarily concerned with accuracy and acknowledge a different timeline than broadcast meteorologists. Here's another thing that we learned. In the state of Texas, the person that pulls the trigger on whether or not to evacuate a city is not an emergency manager. It's a county judge. And do you think they always make their decisions based on science? Not always. So all of these parties want information, and they want it at different times, and they want it in different forms. And all the while, we probably should be thinking about who? The people that we're going to either need to tell to shelter in place or to evacuate. And think about people that have been through hurricanes multiple times. Do you think they act the same way as a first-timer? No, they don't. And our research reveals that they try to predict what's going to happen differently than what a first-timer would. So there's this media sensationalism fear among emergency managers that the media are only in it for the thrilling parts of the story. So our results reinforce that local emergency managers make recommendations for how the community should respond during a hurricane event with the expectation that the county judge, who has ultimate authority for evacuation, will make his or her own decision based on political implications. Evacuation decisions are not just about public health and safety, but also about the economic interests of the area. And some emergency managers express frustration that county judges were not making decisions fast enough as a result. So there is this tension, there is this conflict between organizations and the players in them. So there are significant opportunities being missed from a boundary-spanning perspective of broadcasting, emergency management field, even local National Weather Service offices, and the National Hurricane Center, which is located in Miami, Florida, that sends this information out. So one of the recommendations that we have made in our studies is that we need to bring the media in. We need to treat them as a player. We need to treat them as a full partner in this process, and we need to be mindful of the kinds of deadlines that they do have. All right, the second study, and we'll have a lot more graphics involved with this, was trying to get at what do individuals that live in hurricane areas think about the types of products that the National Hurricane Center uses in trying to inform them about the severity and the risk that they are being exposed to with a tornado approaching their coastline. So we were studying the messages, both visual messages and oral messages. So do they create understanding or confusion? Do they create arousal, or are they boring? Do they instill confidence or doubt? Do they cause people to act, or at least intend to act? So we did 2 studies on message receivers. First, we just wanted to know about the perceptions they had about warning messages. And secondly, we wanted to know about their arousal level. And that's where we come in with the psychophysiology part of this. This was our theoretical and causal model. It's in the handout, and I'm not going to go through it. But it's a fairly complicated one that represents the variables that we were interested in examining in both regression models, but also sometimes in main effects. And I'll probably just talk about the main effects today. Many of you have ever seen this? Everyone's seen this, right? This is what's called a product. This is a National Hurricane Center product. And they're working on these things all the time. These are brilliant individuals. They're incredibly accurate most of the time. The problem they have, and they'll tell you this, is that when we produce a product, we don't know if a 48-year-old woman who is homebound, if she's going to believe this any more than an 18-year-old kid who's watching it on his iPhone. In other words, there's lots of variables in play here. So that's one of their products. You ever seen this one? It's not quite as popular because it's newer, but it shows different times. Does showing time visually help individuals think through the landfall of a hurricane? National Hurricane Center thinks so, but they're not certain. You ever seen this one? You may not have. This is one of their newer products. But what it does is it adds more detail. And that's one of the things scientists are constantly struggling with is, do we provide more detail, because that should reduce the uncertainty, right? That's the whole point here, is reducing uncertainty so people can make decisions about risks. But if you overcomplicate it, what happens? They may ignore it, or they may process the information peripherally. We want them processing it directly in their mind. But they may blow it off because it's too complicated. All right, so here's where we're going with this. We recruited students from the University of Houston. We wanted to go to a test bed that had experience with hurricanes. The mean age was about 30. 70% were female. They had lived in the Houston area about 20 years, and the average is that they had experienced about 2 hurricanes. Some had experienced 0, and that was great. Some had experienced 5 or 6. Here's the results. From a media preference perspective, we asked them, where do you get your information? Well, TV is a big place, still is. And cable TV is a big place that people seek information about hurricane, landfall, and prediction. Radio stations, though, are huge, and they're a lot larger in Hispanic communities. Websites, very large, as are mobile phones. What you see less of is mobile phones without internet access, telephone recordings, and newspapers. There is some newspapers, but it's usually on a post-hoc basis, or 2 days out, 3 days out. What sources do you rely on to get your information? Friends and family. This one surprised us. Emergency managers, NOAA weather radio. Lots of people not having their NOAA weather radios turned on. And then the National Hurricane Center. All right, so remember I told you that they're always wanting to come out with new products? You're going to see 3 new ones that had never been seen by the public before. They were brand new in the making. Handed them to us and asked us to go into a test bed and see what people thought of them. Here's one. How do you like it? This is wind speeds. It's showing different paths of wind. It's interesting, right? What about this one? Now, this is severity of wind, and color-coded to demonstrate severity. How about this one? Remember, this will be on TV for what, 20 seconds? Look fast, write fast, or we might go back and forth with our clicker, right? Rewind and watch it again and so forth. But what are they trying to do here? Again, they're trying to reduce uncertainty, right? By giving you as much information as they possibly can. So you get not only wind, but you get surge, you get flooding, you get tornado risks, and you get marine risks. So those were the three that they asked us to test. And here they are on one shot, because I'm going to be referring to them. And this one's number 2. And it's the winner. Just wanted to show it to you, all right? What happened is that number 2 seemed more clear. It instilled more confidence in the viewers, and it caused less confusion. Number 1, remember all the lines? And number 3 seemed to lack clarity. They seemed to be more confusing, and they reflected poorly on the confidence of the forecaster. Now that's important. The wind speed graphic, the one that showed the different colors, appeared to function much better. In terms of arousal, remember we took heart rate and we took galvanic skin response while they were giving us their responses, because we really do feel like that affect or arousal plays a role in how people attend to information. But found that when people were more aroused, the graphics seemed more clear, it instilled more confidence, and it caused less confusion. So high arousal, that is, if you can create a message along with a graphic that increases arousal to a certain point, it may be critical for motivation. It may aid in effective responses to these graphics. It may result in more effective interpretation of the graphics. And it may lead to more effective responses to threats. Now, there's a theory in communication and psychology called the boomerang effect. And what you don't want to do is to get over that threshold level of arousal, because then people become fearful and they want to tend to any message. But if you can get right up to that level of arousal, what this research has demonstrated is that people will pay more attention and process that information more directly instead of peripherally. So this information, it's in your handout, talks about some of those variables that were in that complicated looking sheet about efficacy and about severity, both of which are very important if you're going to construct messages that tell an individual, this is a threat. This is what you need to do. And we mentioned the arousal is an important piece of this. Howard asked that I just make a really brief mention of the fact that there's I don't know how new this program is, maybe 2 years old or so, but it's NSF's I-Corps, and it's an innovation and commercialization program. We were extremely fortunate to get one of these grants to try to commercialize the research that we gained from the work I've just talked about. And one of the things you learn when you go into the commercialization of research in an entrepreneurial fashion is that the project can pivot 90 degrees like that. And that's what happened. We went to Stanford University and worked with these world-class entrepreneurs for a week, and they convinced us that we wouldn't be able to make a profit on anything that we're trying to sell through our hurricane work. But they did convince us that we could do some real important work with hospital discharges using the same theories, the same work that we learn from people who view hurricane warnings. We can take to people who have been discharged from the hospital and develop specialized messages for them to take off their phone that says, remember, no salt. Remember, weigh yourself every day. Remember, go see your doctor. And what we're doing is developing apps for hospital discharges and trying to keep people from being readmitted to the hospital within 90 days, because the new Health Care Act says under these conditions, if you're readmitted in 90 days, we're not paying for it. And a myocardial infarction readmission is $90,000 each. So hospitals have turned their business models upside down and said, we're not looking for all patients. We're just looking for new patients now. So they have every incentive to try to keep people well once they leave the hospital. So hurricanes to that was a result of I-Corps, and I think that's what it meant to be. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to this distinguished audience this afternoon on coping with collective trauma, ensuring population resilience. For over 30 years, I have been studying how people respond to, cope with, and adjust following traumatic life events. I'd like to consider the kinds of events that I study. They are random, they are unpredictable, they are uncontrollable, and when they are a community-based event, such as a terrorist attack or a natural disaster or a school shooting, they are a shared experience among many victims. I've conducted dozens of studies on literally thousands of individuals over the years. Most of my research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, but in speaking to you today, I'm going to draw from my work in particular on what I have labeled collective traumas. These are local or national events that are shared stressors among many individuals. So I've conducted research on the Southern California firestorms. I have studied the Columbine High School shootings in Littleton, Colorado. My largest project has been on the September 11th terrorist attacks, a 3-year national longitudinal study, and I have studied earthquakes across the world. And I'd like to draw from this research, rather than give you a lot of numbers, I'm going to just give you a quick summary of the research that I have conducted over the years to highlight several common responses to these kinds of collective traumas. Common responses are not exhibited by everybody, but I'm just going to be running through a variety of ways in which we see people respond after these kinds of events. There's shock, disbelief, and emotional numbness. We often see generalized distress, such as sadness, fear, or anxiety. We see decreased positive emotion and decreased psychological well-being. We sometimes see psychopathological disorders. This gets a lot of press: acute stress disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorders, and other anxiety disorders. Sometimes we see survivor guilt, individuals who were less impacted than their neighbors, who feel pretty bad about that consequence. We see ongoing memories, thoughts, and mental pictures of the event. These are often intrusive. People often try to avoid them. They are often associated with anxiety. We hear about sleep disturbances, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, disorganized thought, a need to talk about one's experiences, disruption in functioning across multiple domains: work, school, relationships, even in the household. Importantly, we see somatic symptoms in response to collective disasters, headaches, GI distress, chest pains, etc., which then lead to increased healthcare utilization and, importantly, increased cost. But I focused on the negatives. There are also some positive outcomes that we see after disasters. Many people feel a relief and focus on their good fortune relative to worse off others. We see what's been called post-traumatic growth, seeing meaning in the event, construing personal benefits, learning who one's friends are, changing personal values. People often report a desire to be close with their family, friends, and similarly affected others. And we see positive community effects: altruistic behavior, social cohesion, volunteerism. In fact, we see the best of people in the early aftermath of disasters. But my research has also led me to identify a number of what I have called myths of coping with collective traumas. These are widely held assumptions, sometimes perpetrated in the media, sometimes shared social lore or clinical assumptions that really stand in sharp contrast to the data that I've collected over the last several decades. And the first myth is that psychological responses to these kinds of events are predictable. It's a myth to assume that there are universal reactions to collective traumas. One of the most important messages of my research has been to identify enormous variability in response. It is also a myth to assume that emotional responses to collective traumas will follow a pattern or orderly sequence of stages. Across many studies, we've seen no evidence that people respond in stages of emotional response. It is a myth to assume that psychological responses will be limited to those who are directly exposed to a collective trauma, and I'm going to show you some data that's going to that led me to this conclusion. And moreover, it is a myth to assume that the degree of emotional response will be directly proportional to the degree of exposure or the amount of loss or proximity to the trauma. I have simply not seen across multiple studies that as objective loss decreases, so will distress. And in fact, most of these myths were clearly evidenced in my study on the September 11th terrorist attacks. A national longitudinal study starting at 9 days after the attacks. We followed several thousand people over the next 3 years. We conducted our data across a nationally representative sample, as well as samples from particular communities. And I'd like to just share with you some data in the early aftermath of the September 11th attacks. This chart shows the percentage of individuals in the early aftermath who were reporting high rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms. In fact, they looked a lot like they were exhibiting what would be called PTSD by many, although these individuals in general only learned about the attacks via the media. So in our national sample, the top line, we had about 17% of the country, of the residents that we studied, exhibiting high levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms in the early aftermath. That declined over time. New York City, appropriately, was elevated relative to the national sample. But check out Miami. Indeed, in our study, we found that rates of post-traumatic stress symptomatology were about equal in Miami to New York City. In fact, they were not statistically significant. We also selected 2 other communities that had had a disaster, Oklahoma City, which had the Murrah Federal Building bombing, and Littleton, Colorado, which had the Columbine High School shootings, and you'll note that those numbers look quite different. In fact, Littleton, Colorado was significantly lower in terms of psychological impact than in any of the other communities that we studied. Now, there are many reasons potentially for these particular findings, but I show it to you today to make clear, I hope, that there is no obvious dose-response relationship. These individuals, again, outside of New York City, only learned of the attacks via the media. So over the last decade or so, I have been focusing in particular to see if we can identify what factors might help us understand who is most likely to respond to these kinds of collective traumas with distress, psychological consequences, and in fact also physical consequences as a result of a collective trauma. Who is most at risk for negative psychological and physical outcomes after a disaster? We've identified a variety of factors, demographic factors such as gender, education, and income. Not surprisingly, pre-existing mental health history is about the most important predictor, the strongest predictor of who is going to respond after a disaster with psychological and physical health consequences. Individuals who've had a lifetime or pre-trauma history. In fact, we have found that being exposed to violence during one's lifetime is a very important predictor of responding to a disaster with negative psychological consequences. Individuals under chronic stress are at risk for ongoing concern. We found And this was something that we could identify because we studied individuals after the September 11th attacks within 9 days of the attacks. We measured how people were coping, how they reported coping with the attacks. And what we found is that individuals who reported that they had just given up trying to cope with the events, in fact, showed negative psychological and physical consequences over the next 3 years. And something I just want to, after listening to Dr. O'Hare's presentation, I've realized that this was not meant to be a bash the media panel, but I will tell you that I have been extremely concerned about the ways in which individuals who are highly exposed to traumatic events, in particular through the media, graphic images of exposure to graphic images, indeed seems to set people up for some negative psychological and physical consequences over time. So I want to share with you some of the results of an in-press paper looking at individuals in our national sample who were asked in the first week after the attacks, and again, this was collected right at that time, how many hours of TV and media they had been exposed to on the September 11th attacks in the prior week. So we got them right away and we said, how much television did you watch last week? And at the far left is individuals who reported watching less than an hour. In the middle, individuals who reported 1 to 3 hours. And the far right are individuals who are watching, on average, more than 4 hours of the exposure to the media in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. Now, if you can remember back to what was going on in those days, we saw the planes hit the buildings over and over and over again. We saw the buildings fall down over and over and over again. And what we found, not surprising to us, was that individuals who were reporting, who watched a great deal of television in that early aftermath, were the ones who were experiencing the highest levels of acute stress. That was not particularly surprising, but we did find that those individuals were also showing increased post-traumatic stress response over the next several years. And in fact, physical health responses. Those individuals who watched a lot of television in the early aftermath of the September 11th attacks, and we also looked at the amount of television to which people were exposed after the initiation of the Iraq War, were those individuals who were reporting not only more psychological health consequences, but an increase in physical health outcomes over time. In fact, we believe that it is through the constant exposure, the constant media exposure of graphic images, that the collective events are diffused widely throughout the country. I'd also like to just take a couple of minutes to turn to what we see as predictors of resilience to collective trauma. One is that we see some evidence that people become inoculated, that they benefit from having experienced a prior trauma. And in particular, and this is a sort of challenge, we're trying to understand what factors lead people to become inoculated in response to the next event and what factors lead them to become more sensitized. But one of the things that I'd like you to just look back at is the slide that I showed previously on the early responses to September 11th. One of the fascinating things about what happened in the aftermath of the Columbine High School shootings was that there was a great deal of attention to mental health issues in the aftermath of the Columbine High School shootings. There were a lot of grassroots organizations that built up, and we believe, in fact, that Littleton, Colorado may have been protected from the psychological impact of 9/11, perhaps because of what was implemented in the aftermath of the Columbine High School shootings. In addition, some factors that we see that are important in helping us understand what are predictors of community resilience is when a community has pre-existing community support or strong social institutions. Those communities seem to be protected from ongoing distress in the aftermath of an event, and also an effective rejection of outsiders in the media. The speed with which that occurs seems to portend a better outcome for the community. So we saw this in Virginia Tech, pictures showing up This happened in Newtown. I actually have dozens of slides, but Howard wouldn't let me put them all up. But in fact, I can find almost any event will have somebody put up a sign saying, "Media, get out," because indeed there are many ways in which the media has negative effects both outside the community and within. Just two more. We see that communities that have shared values and community solidarity prior to the event occurring seem to demonstrate more resilience in the aftermath, and communities that have confidence in their authorities seem to, I would say, respond with more resilience in the aftermath. Just like to take a minute or two to talk about ways in which authorities can and community leaders can facilitate community resilience. Certainly one of the things we saw after the Columbine High School shootings and in many other communities is that there are sometimes competing political and policy agendas. I think that avoiding multiple authorities is a very important point. I think that any community in the aftermath of a collective disaster has the opportunity to have a lot of community conflict. Anything that can be done to enlist cooperation among competing groups seems to facilitate community resilience. It's very important to recognize that trust is shaped through repeated actions, and once trust in the government or trust in authorities is lost, it's very difficult to regain it. We say repeatedly to authorities that the public will not panic, and it should not be assumed, and policy should not be in place to assume that people will panic. There's a great deal of social and behavioral science research that has demonstrated that. And last, and again, consistent with what Dr. O'Hare said, we argue that the media should become allies rather than adversaries, although we've talked about the negative consequences potentially for the role of the media after a disaster. There are also many ways in which the media can help engage in effective public education. We still need a great deal of research on collective traumas. We need to clarify the time course of psychological responses. At what point do normal reactions become abnormal and need intervention? We need to understand the differential impact on directly exposed versus indirectly exposed individuals. We need to understand the differential impact of collective traumas on special populations like first responders, law enforcement, children. I even have a project right now we're studying the impact of covering these kinds of disasters on journalists and themselves. And we also need to understand and examine cultural and regional differences in response to collective traumas. Thank you. Well, I'm sorry. There's one more thing I'll say. The ideal research in collecting these kinds of events should identify individuals pre-event if you can, but it also should identify people immediately with continuing post-event assessments. The ideal research is longitudinal. We should use representative samples. I think it's inefficient to conduct studies on small cross-sectional studies with non-representative samples. The ideal research is comprehensive. I should also mention that I am trying to launch a study this weekend on the Boston Marathon bombing, in which we are hoping to be able to address most of these issues here on this slide. Okay, and I'd also like to thank NSF, who has supported my research over the years. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I'm delighted to get to be here today, and I'm especially glad we saw that last slide because it's a great segue into what I'm going to talk about, which is the province of Aceh in Indonesia, which was very strongly damaged by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. First, let me acknowledge my collaborators. This is an interdisciplinary project team that includes sociologists and demographers, economists, psychologists, and geographers. And it wouldn't have been possible to put this team together. We're based both in the United States and Indonesia without funding from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. That's been absolutely critical to get this research done. We've also had funding from the Hewlett Foundation and the World Bank. So let me start with a brief reminder of the event in question. It was a long time ago now, it seems. But on December 26th of 2004, the Sumatran Andaman earthquake took place. This event was an immense earthquake. It measured 9.3 on the Richter scale. It was so strong that it shifted the North Pole by several centimeters. This generated a 1,200-kilometer rupture in the Earth's surface and forced the seafloor upwards by 10 to 15 meters. This next slide is a NOAA product, and it's a great illustration of what the earthquake did. So these dots are where the rip zone was, and as the seafloor rose, it generated a series of waves. These waves moved east across the Indian Ocean, hitting the east coast of Africa about 9 hours later. But to the west, land was a lot closer, and so those waves slammed into the coasts of Indonesia and Thailand, in Indonesia as little as 15 minutes after the earthquake, and there the waves were at heights of up to 17 meters. So you can imagine that the destruction from this event was tremendous. So let's talk a little bit about the shock in Aceh. On the mortality side, roughly 5% of the province's total population died, some 160,000 people, so an immense loss of life. Property destruction was enormous as well, US $4.5 billion, which was about equivalent to the province's gross domestic product that year, so it was a tremendous economic shock. And of the survivors, more than 700,000 were displaced out of their homes and had to find other places to live. The world did not ignore this event. Actually, assistance in the form of pledges poured in, and by 2007, efforts to rebuild Aceh represented the largest reconstruction project ever undertaken in a developing country. Haiti has since eclipsed that. But as big as the shock in Aceh was, it's sadly not unique. There have been a number of major earthquakes since: Pakistan in 2005, China 2008, Haiti 2010, Japan 2011, that killed tens of thousands of people. We've also had a number of events in the U.S. The mortality costs are much lower. Katrina with 1,500 fatalities, and most recently Sandy with 110, but immense property destruction resulted from those disasters as well. So the topic that I want to address using Aceh as an example is the kind of insights into impacts and the recovery process that can inform science and policy. So I want to presage my comments about the results from the project overall by talking a little bit about study designs, and this follows on from what Dr. Silver said. So if you want to understand something about the impact of a disaster over time and how it unfolds, then you need to think your ability to do that is enhanced by a number of features. So one is knowing something about the affected population before the event. If you know something about how the population was doing on various dimensions of well-being before the event, then you're better positioned to understand how things changed for them in its aftermath. Okay, second of all, you'd like to know not only about the individuals in the affected areas, but also about individuals in comparison areas, otherwise similar areas that did not bear the direct brunt of the disaster. Multiple dimensions of people's lives, their families' lives, and their communities can be affected, and so questionnaires need to cover not just one or two dimensions, but multiple dimensions of well-being. And then finally, following individuals over time is critical. So the project I'll talk about, the study of the tsunami aftermath and recovery, or STAR, has these features, and that's been an important part of our ability to learn about how well-being has unfolded in the aftermath of the event. So I'll tell you a little bit about that design. We began by approaching the Indonesian government and obtaining permission from them to draw on a 2004 survey that was conducted throughout Indonesia, but also in the provinces that were affected, Aceh and North Sumatra. And this survey gave us representative population data before the tsunami, so before the event. So that's our baseline study. We then went into the field and to follow up the same respondents, about 27,000 individuals living in Aceh and North Sumatra, and our fieldwork for the first follow-up wave took place 5 to 17 months after the tsunami. We were working both in communities directly affected by the tsunami, and also in comparison areas. And we followed up these respondents annually over 5 years, which has allowed us to trace the evolution of short-term implications and longer-term recovery period. We were able to ascertain survival status for about 98% of those 27,000 individuals. This was by lengthy fieldwork periods and returning to the communities again and again to try to get information, and also working with local communities and also with NGOs. Our recontact rates are between 85 and 93%. They vary by wave. We got higher recontact rates in later waves. And ultimately, we were able to conduct at least one interview with 91% of the survivors that were in our population. Okay, so now an important element of thinking about impacts of the disaster is worrying about how to identify affected areas. So we do that by merging information from two really different sources. One is what the geographers on our project call ground truthing. Other people just call it survey data. We go out and interview people in the community and ask about damage in the community based on interviews with the village leader, and also by using our survey supervisors as direct observers of damage. Then we combine that with satellite images, which allow us to develop an index of damage based on change in ground cover. And so our geography worked on this, and this is easiest to illustrate with some images. This is a place called Gleebrook Village, and this is Gleebrook Village before the tsunami. It's a really beautiful location, great beachfront, roads, bridges, houses, crops, tree crops, and planted crops, and also some aquaculture. So this is about 2 weeks before the tsunami. Our next image is 2 weeks afterward, completely different. The beach has been eroded inland, houses are gone, crops are gone, aquaculture facilities are gone, the road is gone. And another interesting feature which this shows is how localized the impact was. So this slightly elevated area here has been spared, but the water has rushed inland in the low-lying areas, and so created in a very small local area tremendous variation in how much damage was done. Okay, so this is just one community. This is actually not one of our survey communities, but our task now is to take that kind of an approach to assessing damage, scale it up for the 407 communities in which we're working. And so we took the imagery and did that, and that generates a map that lets us stratify our communities by degree of damage, where red is very heavy damage, small yellow dots are no damage, and the bigger yellow dots are moderate damage. And so again, you see that there's heterogeneity in the villages in which we're working in terms of how much damage there was. Okay, so getting to some of the results, I'll look first at mortality. And here's an example of where having data from comparison communities is helpful. This slide may not be in your presentation. I'm an inveterate tinkerer. Okay, so mortality levels. This is mortality by age and sex for villages that were undamaged, and it's very low until it rises at older ages. And very similar for males and for females. Now, the reason it's so close to zero is because I need a big y-axis to add mortality in the villages that were heavily damaged. On average, 25% of the populations of these villages were killed, and there are big differentials by age and sex. Young children and the elderly are the most vulnerable, but among prime age adults, men are far less vulnerable than women, and we're going to come back to see some of the implications of that greater survival for prime age males than for females. Okay, so in the remaining time, I want to focus on 3 key points. First, recovery. Recovery from this kind of a disaster takes years, not months. Second, vulnerability. Not only is it multidimensional, it's dynamic and it unfolds over time. And then finally, the importance of effective targeting and assistance of aid. The recovery efforts that went on in Aceh have been quite amazing in terms of how much they have changed Aceh, and we'll see some examples of that, but there's also evidence of the complexities of getting the targeting right. Okay, so in terms of recovery taking years, not months, one of the indicators we can look at is the fraction of our respondents who are living in homes owned by a household member. Before the tsunami in 2004, that was true for nearly 80% of our respondents. Only true for 47% shortly after the tsunami in 2005-2006. This photograph was about 9 months after the event, and what you see is rubble and one tent in this very badly damaged community. 2 years after the disaster, things are beginning to look a little better. The rates of home ownership have risen back to 64%, and now you see temporary housing that was erected as well as permanent housing. Well, 5 years after the tsunami, home ownership rates are at 77%, insignificantly different from that 79% we started before the tsunami, and that is a direct result of the massive amounts of rebuilding efforts that went on in Aceh. Now, it was not so hard to figure out, building homes is something that can be done, but much less help was available to non-landowners, and that was one of the areas where I think recovery efforts can think hard about how to reach out not only to the people that own land and need their home rebuilt, but those who lost places they were renting or assets destroyed through that way. Okay, let's turn to the I want to come back to Gleebrook Village briefly. So we saw it before and just after the tsunami. How does it look in 2010? A whole lot better. It's really quite astonishing how much of the vegetation has come back. This is a USAID-built road. It's been rerouted, but it's been rebuilt, and there's a new bridge. There are houses again, and the Earth's surface has gone back to being green. The aquaculture has not been restored, but other crops have come back. So there's really an amazing sequence of changes going on. Okay, let's talk about the fact that vulnerability is multidimensional and dynamic. So we heard a little bit about post-traumatic stress in the last presentation. We also looked at that as an indicator of well-being. And this slide just looks at levels of post-traumatic stress reactivity for the people living in the heavy damaged communities at the time of the event, as well as those in the undamaged communities. And so one thing to notice is that shortly after the event, levels were elevated for both populations. It's not only in the heavy damage areas that we see these psychological reactions. They come down over time, and by 2008 or so, they've stabilized and are not significantly different between the two groups, which is what those two things say. There was some mental health counseling available, but not a whole lot. And outside the heavy damage zone, that was much more likely to be accessed by the best educated and was almost non-existent for those at other parts of the socioeconomic spectrum. Okay, before we saw the mortality slide and we looked at the difference in mortality rates for males and for females, with prime-age men being more likely to survive. So another aspect of dynamic vulnerability has to do with rates of losing your spouse if you're a male. Okay, so those go very strongly up in the heavy damage area to 10% for males 45 to 59 in the first wave of data collected after the tsunami. But by the second wave, they're right back down again. There's tremendously rapid remarriage among the males who lost a spouse. And so in the later waves of the survey, there are not significant differences between the men living in the undamaged areas and the men living in the heavily damaged areas in terms of widowhood. We don't see this for women, by the way. They do not remarry. The other thing that happens with these remarriages is these men are on average marrying significantly younger women than they were married to before the tsunami, but because educational attainment has been rising, those women are better educated. And so there will be very interesting impacts in terms of relationships within the household as these marriages play out over time. Okay, I want us to talk briefly about children as well, because the other thing that the high mortality rates did, of course, is create orphans. So in our study, in the heavily damaged areas, 1 out of every 6 children between the age of 10 and 18 at the time of the tsunami lost a parent or parents in the tsunami. But what the impacts of those losses were varies a lot by gender and by age at orphanhood, and also over time. Scholarship programs were widely available, but they didn't reach nearly so much the children who were older, who were 15 to 17 when their parents were killed in the tsunami, as younger kids. And we see significant consequences. 1 year later, older male orphans were much less likely to be in school, and older female orphans were much more likely to report housekeeping as their main activity. 5 years later, older male orphans have 1.7 fewer years of education and are 34% more likely to be working than their same-age counterparts who didn't lose parents. And among those girls, they're 56% less likely to be in school and 62% more likely to be married. Effects were much more muted for the children who were between 9 and 14 when they were orphaned. Scholarships did reach these children, and at our 5-year measurement point, we see very little differences between them and their same-age peers on these dimensions of well-being. That's not to say there weren't quite different psychological consequences. So let me wrap up and say again how critical funding from both NSF and NIH has been to this undertaking. I believe that investment in data collection has huge payoffs both for basic science and also for assistance policies in the aftermath of these disasters. What lessons from our study might generalize to other contexts? Well, in infrastructure disasters, although the pace of rebuilding is slow, ultimately it can succeed, and it really did succeed in Aceh, both in terms of roads and bridges, but also in terms of housing. Targeting assistance is a lot more complicated for programs that aim to improve health and educational attainment. And in high mortality disasters, of which we've had a shocking amount, family composition changes. This invokes replacement for some, efforts to remarry, and there's been also a large fertility increase. But for some others, replacement is not so easy. Children's biological parents can't be replaced, and that looks like it sped transitions to adulthood for those who were 15 to 17 when they lost their parents. Finally, although we looked at that Gleebrook village and it looks very similar in 2010 to how it used to look, population size has not recovered. It's a smaller and different place than it was, and researchers are finding that in New Orleans as well in the aftermath of Katrina. So I do think there are generalizable aspects of the study as well. Thank you.